There you go. For the sake of the video, I do that welcome for everyone who's going to watch after the event. As I said, we've only got 5 verses, and it's one of those I kind of kept playing with, should we just do 5 or should we do more? Last week we had quite a lot of verses and they all kind of hang together as that single unit, so I didn't want to I didn't want to kind of and last week we actually spent over an hour just talking about those verses, so I've kept these together. Matthew 21, we start to now move into what we'd think of as the Easter narrative. So it makes sense to treat that separately. And so this is a kind of a conclusion to the phase where Jesus has moved down to Judea. He's been ministering around Judea. Matthew doesn't give us much in terms of the shape of that, his travels around Judea. We get more of that from Luke's gospel. And of course, there are other bits that we also get from John and from particularly from John. So Luke and John give us a lot more about Jesus' kind of Judean ministry. We get hints from Matthew and Mark, but as of next time, we'll be kind of pushing into the Easter story. So this is kind of a conclusion to that previous session. Oh look, I've given it the title, which was last week's title. That shouldn't say position, privilege, and passion. I should say something like healing Bartimaeus, except of course in today's verses we don't actually get his name, so I should have changed the title there. Just because last time the transition verses just here. So here's the first verse 29. As they were going out from Jericho, a great crowd followed him. I mentioned some verses which I then had failed to actually put into the presentation last week, which threw me. So I thought I'd just for completion's sake I'd put them there so you can actually see them, and because they kind of highlight something of the transition moment that Jericho must have made. It's not that any of the gospel writers have kind of particularly spelt it out, but it's kind of interesting that from all of these different sources you get a moment happening in Jericho which really sets up the Easter narratives as we get into them. So the Marsaba letter is just a kind of quick reminder, which is supposedly written by Clement of Alexandria. I had a quick review after last week just to remind myself. The majority of scholars who study the letters of the early church fathers think the letter is genuine, but lots of biblical scholars don't like it because they just don't want to accept any extra bits, say we don't need to add them to the Gospels. So a bit more kind of cautious in the biblical scholars from those who study the letter as an ancient letter. But the consensus, therefore, of kind of scholarly opinion is that the sort of a small majority seem to treat the letter seriously. And as it doesn't say too much that's controversial, I think it's not a bad thing to kind of draw on, try and get some of the history context. So what we were looking at, so after these words, he comes into Jericho. So this is the passage we're looking at now. If I go back a couple. So as they were going out from Jericho, but as they had come into Jericho, this was last week, as he comes into Jericho, the secret gospel, that translation of secret there is the word mysteron. It's the kind of, it's not so much that what the letter seems to imply is that Mark had done a kind of a more extensive gospel that is used more for those who are really in the church. But then what he's arguing about is that it's then being corrupted. So you're almost getting a sense of in the Christian Egyptian church, they've got the gospel of Mark because Mark has gone to Alexandria and he's the leader of the church in Alexandria. While he's there, it seems then, or this is the implication of this letter, that he has kind of added some bits to the gospel, and that those who are kind of really in the study or really in the heart of it have started to take those things on. But then there's a Gnostic sect which is that starts to develop in Alexandria, which is what's being addressed here. And they've taken that and they've implied all sorts of other things in there, some of which are very sexual, and he's trying to address that and saying, no, this is really what was in this other gospel. This wasn't. In that context, he has now Oh yes, sorry. What we'd said previously, he'd kind of told the story about when they'd come to Bethany, a certain woman whose brother had died there. Coming, she prostrated herself before Jesus and says to him, "Son of David, have mercy on me." So I wanted to put those verses there because some of the words come back to kind of come round again. The certain. I think I've done this again. I think. I never actually. I don't believe it. Sorry, I've actually the quote I actually wanted. I've missed out a second time. Let me quickly hang on because there's only two of you. I can get away with this. I know that I've got it in my notes. So, or did I have it in the previous one? Oh, okay. Sorry. It was okay. It was one above. Let me just. Yeah. So after the words, and he comes into Jericho. That's right. The secret gospel adds only. So he's saying it doesn't add anything else. The sister of the youth whom Jesus loved, and his mother, and Salome were there, and Jesus didn't receive them. So that I told you about that last time. But just notice the sister of the youth whom Jesus loved. So what we looked at, and then he then goes on to say, but many of the other things that you're writing to me about seem to be falsifications. In other words, they've been corrupted, so we can't trust them. But these things, he said, were part of Mark's extended testimony. And so he refers to the sister of the youth whom Jesus loved. He's previously said when they came to Bethany, there was a certain woman whose brother, so the sister of the man, had died, and whose brother had died there. And she prostrated herself and says, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." And so it seems that the sister of the youth whom Jesus loved is probably Lazarus, who actually we saw last week he's described as a young man, and he's a wealthy young man. So some think of him as possibly the rich young ruler. I don't think that quite fits myself, but so the implication is this is the disciple that is being referenced, and we're now reading about his sister. So the sister could be Mary or Martha. And this is it all kind of fits. This is why I'm not anti it, because what it's saying is as they come into Jerusalem, we've had a situation with James and John looking to be on the left and right of Jesus. There's a strong tradition that Salome is actually the name of their mother, although Salome is a very common name, so it could be somebody else called Salome, but their mother's name is Salome. So James and John and their mother who've been talking to Jesus. So Salome is in the mix just before they get to Jericho. Now they come into Jericho, and now the sister, is that Martha or is it Mary? Well, she might be there along with Lazarus, but Jesus didn't receive them. So it's not. We can't be certain with these things, but you get this sense that now what does it mean that Jesus didn't receive them? Well. There's a huge crowd travelling with Jesus. We kind of pick that up in the verses we're going to look at in a second. So it's not that he's rejecting them, but he hasn't got time to spend time with them. And if you think of it in those terms, because actually quite a few of these characters then, when Jesus does get down to Jerusalem, they have that meal for him. And there, the Martha is there, and Lazarus is there, so the sister and the youth. Salome isn't mentioned at being at that meal, but she is there in the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. She's one of the witnesses of the resurrection. She's one of the people who take myrrh to dress the body and first see and encounter Jesus. So you're hearing about characters that are all coming together, staging around Jericho. And Jericho is a key kind of point on the pilgrim route towards Jerusalem. It's getting close to Passover. Lots of people are now travelling down. And it seems that in Jericho, because here, so the sister of the youth whom Jesus loved and his mother. Now, is that the mother of the youth or is it Jesus' mother? I think it's probably Jesus' mother. And actually there is also that tradition that makes Salome And it's not just purely tradition. It's a way, one of two ways of reading a verse in the Gospels, where it talks about Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Jesus' aunt, Salome. And what you can't tell is Jesus' aunt, well, is that Mary, the wife of Clopas, or is it the Salome, you see, or is it both of them? It could be any of those kind of combinations. But what you're seeing here perhaps is Jesus, that there's a gathering of people who are slightly extended family, members of Jesus' wider familial connections, because you can make a case that Salome is his aunt, his mother is there with Salome, that makes sense. And then seems to be either Mary Magdalene or Mary and Martha, or Martha. Lazarus, who they're going to host there at Bethany. And we're going to find those kind of folks seem to be lodging around that space. So in a general way, you kind of get the impression as Jesus is in this final week, as he's about to run down towards Jerusalem for the final Easter, or not the final Easter, the first Easter, the final old Passover, that characters are beginning to kind of come together around Jericho. And so that I think comes into the context of the story that we're going to hear about today, we're going to look at. Because there's a kind of an interesting discrepancy, as I put it, between Matthew's Gospel and Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel. So this is one of those kind of interesting little incidents, because from those who like to be selective in what they really do or don't believe in the Gospels, they like this incident because they see that all three Gospels tell the story about Jesus healing some blind people near Jericho. But all three accounts are slightly different, you see. So obviously in Matthew's Gospel, as we're going to look at it, there are two blind men who don't get named. In Mark's Gospel, there's one blind man who gets named. And in Luke's Gospel, there are two blind men who don't get named, but they get healed while Jesus is approaching Jericho, whereas in Matthew and Mark, they get healed as Jesus is leaving Jericho. So for those who like to take we look for proper history, they say this is the kind of thing you expect with real history, that things get a bit confused and so on. But those of us seeing, but is there something where you don't have to say that the Gospels are wrong, but they reflect different perspectives? And if you try and put things together in that way, I think some of the surrounding stuff that we've just been touching on in the last couple of weeks, the fact that we see that Jericho is more than just an event. It's not kind of like Jesus is going down to Jerusalem and as soon as he walks past Jericho, he's then, it's not a kind of a continuous flow, that there are stops and stages along the way, and that probably Jericho becomes a bit of a hub for a day or so, because there are a number of events, probably too many to happen in one day, that happen around Jericho. And when we see that, we can actually see how Luke's description of as they're approaching, first encountering the blind men, Matthew and Mark also, their perspective as Jesus is leaving, they can all be part of a single event. And it's just the way that you look at it that determines how you tell it. So as I put here, we also know from Luke's Gospel that Jesus lodges with Zacchaeus around Jericho as well. And the fact that he's lodging implies there's more than one day. So if he's lodging, it's not actually complicated to see Jesus kind of both coming and going and into the town centre itself, maybe living outside because there's big crowds, lodges with Zacchaeus for a bit, but there's a bit of toing and froing over a period of a few days, which allows the time for a number of these events that we find packed around Jericho. James and John, their mother, then the extension group of James, John, their mother, and also Lazarus and Mary, and Jesus' own mother. They're all kind of coming together. And actually then as we understand it, we get the story whereby in Luke's Gospel, as Jesus is approaching, he's got a big crowd with him. And I haven't put the text up for Luke's gospel because we're really supposed to be working through Matthew. But similarly, we're going to touch on things that come from Mark, but they all tie together. And then we'll ask the question, so why doesn't Matthew say so much as some of the others? So if you're kind of putting the story together as Jesus is approaching, there's a huge crowd with him, and my solution, if that makes sense, which is not something you have to accept or not, it's much more kind of a working solution, is that as they're approaching with the crowd, it tells us about, in Mark's gospel, about Bartimaeus asking what all the fuss is about, hearing it's Jesus, and then we hear about him crying out. So I suspect that and there's only Bartimaeus there. There's not two blind men. We're going to do the text in a minute, but if I give you my solution, we'll see as we go through. So my suspicion is that it's Bartimaeus is there as Jesus approaches. He picks up the noise of the crowd. He starts calling out, but in the mix of things, we're told, of course, how people are rebuking and saying, "Be quiet, shut up," and the noise is drowned out. But maybe Jesus does pick something up of it, but Jesus doesn't necessarily heal instantly. When he heals, the healing is instantaneous, but in terms of Bartimaeus calling out, and then of course a whole load of other things happen, like there's the meeting with Zacchaeus and lodging with him, and so on. And then as Jesus is leaving, here is still Bartimaeus who's been calling out, and by now he's actually gone to get a friend, somebody he also knows, because they have this once in a lifetime opportunity of a miracle worker who they've heard about and know stories about, the blind being healed, and they're bringing their infirmity in now as Jesus leaves, and in one sense they're continuing to call out. And then Jesus stops and turns around and heals them instantly, and they go on and follow him. So if something like that happened, you can see how all of the perspectives could tell the story truly in the way they've told it. As Jesus approaches, there's one guy, and that's why who's significant, Bartimaeus, who notices what's going on. He starts to call out. He's drowned by the crowds. There are events that go on in Jerusalem. Jesus is there for a day or so, and as they're leaving, he's still there calling out, but he's now got a friend with him. He's brought into the mix. And then Jesus, maybe he's heard them up to now, and we're going to think about the meaning as we get into the text as to why Jesus. This is the last miracle before we start the Easter narrative, the final one, that Jesus stops and turns around and heals him. So that's my kind of way of putting all the pieces together, three Gospels, and the important thing to resolve are the three Gospels. But I partly get the sense of the busyness of Jericho, that period around Jericho, from things that we've looked at over the last few weeks, not just the Marsaba letter, but even before that we saw there was a little bit more information. Hang on, I'm just trying to remember. In the Gospel of the Nazarenes, when we were looking at the, is it the parable of the first, is it the parable of the miners? I can't remember which one it was now. But anyway, you're getting it seems to be an incident that there's quite a lot of stories about Jesus out there that are outside of the gospel, is what I'm saying, which gives you the sense that it's a busy time. It's an important moment where key figures are all coming together. So we go on with the text, verse 30. So notice, look, two blind men are sitting alongside the road, and hearing that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And the crowd chided them, saying that they should shut up. But they cried out more and more, saying, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." So as Jesus is leaving, their voices now together. There's been an anticipation in Bartimaeus. In Luke's gospel, it talks about Bartimaeus being there as Jesus approached and starting the call. Now as Jesus is leaving, they're continuing the call, but now there's the second one there. So stopping, Jesus called them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they spelled out to him, "Lord, let our eyes be opened." And moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and straightway their eyes received sight, and they followed him. So then there's that question, as we know the name blind Bartimaeus, or Bartimaeus who's born blind, but Matthew doesn't name him. Peter does. Peter is, as we've touched on before, is the source of Mark's eyewitness kind of details. And so there's some interesting little bits that I see in Mark's gospel in the naming, because there's a rather strange, and I say strange because it's not a contradiction. It's just one of these odd things, and you have to ask yourself why does Mark do this? Because he says there's a man sitting by the road. He is the son of Timaeus, so he names the father. And then he kind of comma, normally in New English translations, but he's the son of Timaeus, Bartimaeus. And lots of people will say, but hang on, why on earth what on earth is Peter, or what is Mark saying here? Why? Because Bartimaeus means the son of Timaeus, and he's just said the son of Timaeus, you see. So it's just one of these little kind of quirks. It's kind of like he's the son of Timaeus, and Bartimaeus is more of a label than a name. It's a kind of, it's the way, it's a secondary way of identifying someone, So my first name is Kristen, but I am the son of Roger. And when you've got lots of people with the same name, you often qualify with them whose son they are. So if you have a common name, or so if there were hundreds and hundreds of people called Kristen, you might want to identify me by saying Kristen, the son of Roger. But this isn't the case here, because he's introduced as being the son of Timaeus, and then his name is given Bartimaeus. But that in itself is slightly odd, because Timaeus is actually a Greek name, and Bar is an Aramaic extension. So you almost, he's a kind of a strange hybrid. It's highly likely from that title or that name given to him that he has a Greek father via an Aramaic or Hebrew mother, and has grown up in a Hebrew context. That's not unusual at all. Obviously, that happens with Timothy as well. So Timothy's father is Greek, and his mother is that way around, isn't it? Or is it the other way? Yeah, and the mother is Hebrew. So it seems that there's something of that going on, and that's worth noting for two reasons. Because we are one of the things that comes out as we start to work through the Passion narratives, the Easter narratives, crucifixion and the resurrection, is that the focus of Jesus' ministry starts to shift towards the nations. And so we see, for instance, in John's Gospel that there are Greeks who are there as Jesus is going into the temple, and they're brought to Jesus, and Jesus communicates with them, and it's probably in reaction to that then Jesus clears the temple of the traders. Now that the traders are situated in the court of the Gentiles, so you've got these Greek, these Greek, not Greeks who are visiting, because people do in the ancient world. The Romans and the Greeks used to go to visit to see Passover and the festivals, and they were fascinated by Judaism because it was monotheistic. You see, so lots of folks were interested and would come as kind of tourists. But then they can't even get into the temple forecourts where they're allowed, the court of the Gentiles, because it's all about trading, you see. So that the turning over of the money tables actually is in a kind of a context of Jesus having just met Greeks who are trying to come into to see what's going on. And I won't try and do it now, but it's one of those fascinating things when you put all the little pieces together, how many prophetic words this kind of series of incidents fulfill. And as you look at them, it's often to do with the nations, you see. So what we're seeing now as we come into this phase now, Jesus has moved south to Judea, but now as he comes to Jerusalem for the final Passover of his earthly ministry, the transition is going to turn around and change. And so it's not insignificant, therefore, I think, in this context, although Matthew is not drawing it out, but Mark's gospel does, that you've got someone who's a bit of a half and half, and who's blind, and the name Timaeus actually means honour. So you have a strange situation where you have someone who is a son of honour, a kind of half Gentile but honourable son, who's going to receive spiritual sight at this as the final miracle of Jesus's kind of run before he gets to Jerusalem. So the final healing, and Mark's gospel, as I understand it, according to the early church, is delivered in Rome, and it's based on the preaching of the teaching of Peter to the Roman church. And so we read about how there were members in the early church fathers, how there were requests made by some of those members of the Praetorian Guard as Roman citizens that Mark should write down what Peter had been teaching them. And that's why we get so much of kind of Peter's eyewitness detail in Mark's gospel. So here in Mark's gospel, as Peter is talking to a Gentile world, he's given us the name of someone who really does exist, and who they remember because he's somehow become the more significant character. And by emphasizing that he's the son of Timaeus, i.e. he was the son of a Gentile, so he's the son of a Gentile, but then he has to clarify, so we call him Bartimaeus, because you don't speak Aramaic, so you don't realize that I've just called him son of Timaeus, and if we were going to say that in Hebrew, we would call him Bartimaeus. So he puts all of those things together. Now, you might think, and you wouldn't necessarily be unfair, that I'm making a bigger deal of the tiny little things that they're in the gospel. And so, what I would say is everything I'm speculating on, these are the things I like to stop and you think about and try and understand the characters. And so I think that there are a number of little bits that come together that make sense of the early church's traditions around the writing of the Gospels, that Mark has delivered in Rome, that you can see why Peter, as he preaches it, if he knows the guy because he's been following Jesus, part of the early church, part of the church in Jerusalem, they know his miracle story. That seems to be confirmed by the fact that we have 3 accounts of it that all seem to have some degree of independence in that their details are slightly different. But the difference doesn't mean you can't integrate them together into a single story. So that means it's very likely a story that was talked about. So we all know who he is, and of course he may have another Hebrew name. But when Peter is there talking about it in Rome, he kind of wants to emphasize he's got a Greek dad. He's a Gentile dad. But he had that great miracle of having his eyes opened, which is a lovely little kind of point for, as I'm preaching to you Gentiles, if you're honourable sons, which is what the name means, but they would have understood that, the son of Timaeus, he's an honourable son. If you're an honourable son, then maybe the Lord will open your eyes spiritually. See, you can imagine that kind of agenda going on. But as we come back to Matthew, the key thing that in one sense comes out of Matthew's gospel is that it's a final experience really of the deaf hearing and the blind seeing. But now it's the blind seeing. It's an emphasis on Jesus' messiahship. So and you get that from the fact that as they cried out the more, saying, "Lord, have mercy on us, son of David." So the phrase "son of David" gets used more in the final week of Jesus' life, in the Passion narratives, the Easter story. We find increasingly individuals referring to Jesus as the son of David. And the thing that's important to recognize in that is, you remember how if you follow the revelation of Jesus as Messiah through the Gospels, early on we have often Son of God, the Christ, and so on, people speculating. And there's a lot of speculation early on in the stories as you go through. Then we have that key moment where Jesus says of his disciples, "And who do you say that I am?" And Peter turns around and says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you, but my Father in heaven." This is a true thing. But that's a private moment with his disciples. Now as we come, this is the beginning, if I put it that way, the beginning of a moment where lots of people start to express this messianic title, Son of David. So there is a sudden sense in which the meaning of Jesus' ministry is suddenly becoming much more evident. And that's wonderfully illustrated by the fact that you have a blind man who recognises the truth of it and calls out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David," messianic title. I recognise you're the Messiah. And actually, as Jesus heals him, there's a kind of a sense of that seeing Jesus as the Messiah is now prophetically recognised by the fact he has sight, if that makes sense. So anyway, yeah. These are the last two verses. I told you it was a quick one today. They spelled out, let our eyes be open, and being moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and straightway their eyes received sight, and they followed him. Now, as we say, the next verse, which is then chapter 21, Jesus is now arriving in the environs of Jerusalem. And as we're getting there, we're suddenly finding the characters that seem to have been kind of staging together closely as Jesus finally goes through Jericho for the last time. Characters that have come together, including here now. There's someone who's having to beg. They're the lowest of the low, but there's something about them that has recognised Jesus' messiahship, and we're going to hear that more and more in the voices of people in the run-up to that final Passover. Jesus being referred to with messianic titles, in particular the Son of David, a lot more. So those are a handful of verses that we're covering. As I say, I think therefore, if I just spell it out, kind of trying to strip them out of the different agendas, I think that I suspect therefore that as Matthew, who's representing the Matthew's gospel is, if you like, the first official gospel when all of the disciples are together working on the apostles' teaching, and Matthew as their scribe has drawn together Matthew's gospel with its huge number of events. It's the most complete gospel, if you think of it like that. It tells us more about Jesus' teaching and events than the others do, each individual one. So it's the kind of the official, the authorized by the full set of apostles as they're there together. When he's told the story, he's focused on Jesus' compassion and the sight that is coming by those who are recognizing Jesus with a messianic title. So general members of the public, here is the lowest of the low. Not only are they begging, but they can't even see, but somehow they've seen that Jesus is the Messiah. They declare it, and then they get healed. So that seems to be Matthew's agenda. Mark's agenda is probably, and not only that, but actually he had a Gentile dad, so he was the son of Timaeus, a guy called Timaeus, which is a Greek name. And Plato actually has a whole one of his, I don't know if he writes books, what do you call them, paper. He actually is called Timaeus, I think. He's actually got a book, he has a philosophical treatise called Timaeus. It's a Greek name. So he's kind of highlighting to a Gentile audience in Rome. He was a son of a Gentile. So I have to explain it to you. In when we say it in Aramaic, we'd say Bar, which means son of, Bartimaeus. And he's getting healed. So that's kind of great for that agenda. And in Luke's agenda, where it's back to the two of them again, I'm just trying to think it's probably not dissimilar, I guess, to Matthew's, but just told slightly differently in the mix of things, because he focuses again on, I think, the phrase "Son of David." And if we kind of now see it really as the conclusion of that southern phase, it's a great conclusion. Someone who's the lowest of the low, as a beggar. I suppose he could have been a criminal, but someone who in theory shouldn't be able to see, recognizes Jesus' messiahship, and receives a blessing, i.e. their sight in that context, by someone who then goes on and follows him, to the degree that actually we know a bit about his family, and he's probably been talked around and become a significant testament in the early church. So those are my thoughts. May not have been as exhaustive as other times, but did either of you, so everyone knows there's only two folks here today, either of you wanted to ask a question or make any comments?